Good afternoon, everyone. It's Andy Sherritt here from IT Health. Thank you very much for joining and being punctual. It's a warm old day, so I hope you're not cooking too much in your home offices or your offices. We're just going to give people another minute or two before we start. As ever, quite a lot of people are still joining, so bear with us a moment and we'll kick things off. Hi again. Just for those people that have joined since I last spoke, we're just holding on for another minute just to let a couple more people join and then we'll get started. Thank you. Right, I think we'll make a start. Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. It's another warm day. Quite nice to get that at this time of year. Hope you're all well. I'll just start by doing some introductions so that you know everyone that's kind of hosting the webinar, and then we'll get stuck in. So I'll go first. My name's Andy Sherritt. I'm the Head of Business Development here at IT Health. I'll hand over to you, Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Lee Robinson. Public sector account executive there on the sort of Eastern Territory for Sophos. Over to you, Costa.
Thank you. And then, yep, it's me, Costa. I'm a sales engineer here at Sophos. I'll be leading the technical presentation this afternoon. And yeah, we will get into what makes device encryption easy with Sophos and IT Health.
Cheers, Lee. Cheers, Costa. So it's Andy again. So just a couple of housekeeping points. Usual stuff. We're recording the webinar, so you will get a copy sent to you, a link to view that recording, which you can obviously share with any of your other colleagues who couldn't make it today. Also, we would welcome your questions, so please post questions as you think of them within the sort of question panel within the webinar. We will then save some time at the end to cover those as part of the Q&A. So yeah, more questions the better, please. In terms of the webinar itself, we're running a series of webinars with Sophos focused on our NHS customers. They've all been really well attended, so thank you for that. I hope you're finding them useful. Today we're focusing in on Sophos Encryption and how we can make this easy for you as opposed to some of the other sort of Microsoft native tools. I know from looking at who's here that a number of you are already using Central, so this should be potentially a quick win for you guys, and for those of you who aren't, this might be another good reason for you to think about kind of migrating over to Sophos Central. So yeah, I hope it's going to be interesting for you. Please do ask us some questions as we go through. But Lee, I'll hand over to you, please.
Lovely, thanks, Andy. So just setting the scene for today, really, looking at the agenda. I'm going to run through an introduction to encryption and the different types, also cover off different methods of managing encryption. There's various tools out there, but we're obviously focusing on the further consolidation to Sophos Central that Andy's already mentioned there. Why Sophos? Further consolidation, obviously, as I've mentioned, but also around the sort of ease of management and bringing the devices, users, policies all into one place, which we'll go into a bit more detail on. Then we'll dive into a demo briefly just to show the key features and how that sort of looks in terms of the encryption piece. We'll run through the Q&A towards the end of the session and then close out with various comments. So from there, hopefully that's a good set for today. I don't think we'll be taking up the full hour, but I'll hand you over to Costa now to run through the session. And as Andy says, please do raise any questions as we go through the chat.
Brilliant, thank you very much for that, Lee. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Obviously today the main focus is about encryption. So I thought what better way to start than to actually discuss what encryption is. Now, I think it's probably safe to say that everyone on the call knows what encryption is these days. It's everywhere we look. So we're actively encouraged to look for that familiar padlock while browsing the internet, whether it's online shopping or doing our banking. We've got things like WPS and AES for our Wi-Fi SSIDs. And then, of course, we've got the full-blown file encryption and full disk encryption possibilities as well. The purpose remains the same, though, to secure our valuable information. We want to hide it away from those unauthorized prying eyes. So when we encrypt our data, we're truly changing the entropy of that data. It's no longer arranged or structured in its original format, but it's instead effectively being jumbled up so that it can't just be examined, as it were. The basis for the encryption is that you take your data, you encrypt it with an encryption algorithm, and then you only have access to it to decrypt it with the appropriate decryption key. Now, whether or not that decryption key is something that you type in or whether it's a physical device that you use to gain access, the principle remains the same. Without the key, you can't view the data. Simple. But just keep in mind here, there is a really stark difference between something like a password protected file and truly encrypted data. Now today, we're here to specifically discuss device and disk-based encryption, why it's important, some options to manage it, and of course, why Sophos and IT Health can help and how we can do so. So to begin with then really, we want to encourage ourselves to have a look at why we want to encrypt data. Well, if we think about it, why wouldn't we want to encrypt our data these days? Back in the day, not too long ago, encryption meant reduced performance on machines. Data loss was taken a lot less seriously because not everything was digital. There was less tighter compliance. But now, hardware is optimized so encryption has little to no performance hit. But more significantly, data loss is taken very seriously. And to be fair, rightly so. And when we consider the data that's actually in the NHS, well, of course, the crown jewels there are the patient data that's available. But now, in fact, data security is taken extremely seriously these days. So if we want to be compliant with any of the many compliance standards that exist, we too need to take the security of our data, and I guess the data of others here, very seriously. But in order to be compliant, you don't just have to be able to encrypt your data, you have to be able to prove it too. But let's be honest, we shouldn't be encrypting our data just because we might be fined or similar. Year on year, millions of laptops are stolen, they're misplaced, lost, and many of them are of course containing that potentially important and sensitive data. Now, before COVID-19, sure, there was a lot more people on the road, on the trains, buses, all places where their devices can be misplaced, lost, stolen. But even now, with more and more people working from home, these devices are still very much a risk. The data on them is no longer sat in a secured workplace, where there might be security sat on the door, where the machine might even be bolted to the desk. Now, admittedly, in the NHS, there's a lot of patient-facing machines that may be not as susceptible to being lost or misplaced. But for those that I guess don't know me, I had a long stint in the NHS, about 14, 15 years, mostly working across GP practices and health centres. I actually saw my fair share of machines being stolen out of these practices. Now, one story in particular that I think will probably live with me for quite a long time was a GP practice in North Birmingham that was situated in a terraced, almost shop-like building, like a high street, and it was broken into and all of its machines were stolen. The practice itself was secured well, had secured doors, windows, shutters, etc. But amazingly, the practice was broken into from the adjacent building. The masterminds, if we want to call them that, broke into the residence above the shop next door, made their way into the roof space or the attic before breaking into the GP's practice attic and then making their way down to steal all of the GP's equipment through the hatch and then actually taking it back out of that direction as well. So, okay, maybe it's a bit of a rare instance, but again, it just really goes to show that physical device security doesn't guarantee anything. When we now factor in that, again, many of our supported devices are within people's homes, even within the NHS, This means that our devices and our data are now potentially even more susceptible to theft. So really then, encryption is the essential defense to protect your data in any of these events. Now, many of you are no doubt thinking, well, my patient data is in the cloud, I may be using Office 365, or things are stored on my very secure, well-protected servers. And that itself is great, it's commendable, and it's of course a great effort to even get to that point. But we've got to be honest with ourselves here. How many of our users that are working from locally cached or download copies are accessing this data? How many of them are creating the files locally first before putting them in the place that they need to be? So the principles really remain here the same. We should be encrypting all of our data and our devices. So then, how do we traditionally do the encryption? Well, over the many years, there's been many third-party encryption tools that use proprietary encryption methods. I don't think I need to mention any of those vendors by name, but I'm sure we've all had experience with them. And I'll throw in the good old Sophos Safeguard into that category too. The reality is the majority of these solutions, they prove difficult to manage, and in some cases they really did come with performance drawbacks. Now, with BitLocker having been made available for things like enterprise versions of Windows 7, then pro versions of Windows 8.1 and 10, it's become a much more popular way to establish device encryption. But BitLocker, I guess as with many things Microsoft, has often been a little bit complicated to manage, maybe difficult to report on, and generally a bit all over the place with regards to where we configure it, because as you can see on the screen, there's many ways to do so. Now, of course, I've got some of the methods listed here, from configuring and enabling BitLocker locally through to the group policies and Active Directory, and even MBAM. But then, of course, there's the paid offerings that Microsoft offer in SCCM, Intune, or even the latest Endpoint Manager. Now, the reality of all these tools is that they don't really lend themselves to great visibility. We've, of course, got to go then and contend with lots of different options when it comes to configuring BitLocker in the right way. And when we think about using group policies with Active Directory, for example, we can then see we might end up in a bit of a muddle because Active Directory keeps all BitLocker keys, not just the ones that are current and correct. There's of course the more simplistic option here, which is to export the recovery key information, save it as a TXT file somewhere, maybe keep them all in one master location, maybe even put them all into a master spreadsheet. And hey, I'll put my hands up and say I've very much done this in the past because my Active Directory schema didn't support the BitLocker functionality. But the reality is this isn't really secure and it's not great practice. In fact, we could actually say it's quite an unreliable way to keep all of our security keys. Then there was MBAM, Microsoft's BitLocker administration and monitoring tool. I guess for me, the shining light in all of the issues that BitLocker had, it was the tool that many people have used and still do use today. But unfortunately, there is now an issue with MBAM in that its mainstream support ended in July 2019. So that leaves many in a bit of a pickle because Microsoft's go-to now for BitLocker management is either via SCCM or the Intune equivalent, and not every organization has access to that or the funds to get the appropriate licensing, or it might not be appropriate to go and get the licensing just to manage BitLocker, for example. So where does that bring us? Well, that brings us to Sophos and what we can do to help, and ultimately is the reason that we're having this webinar today. So we have the Sophos Central Device Encryption option. And as with everything Sophos, we've tried to make this as simple as possible to use and get the most out of. So that for us, that means that we can not only manage BitLocker encryption for Windows, but also file vault encryption on the Mac OS devices. And that is that we do full end-to-end encryption management of these encryption methods. And doing so requires no additional back-end infrastructure or application servers to support this. If you're already a Sophos Central Endpoint and InterceptX customer, which Andy suggested that there's a few of you on here today, it means that deployment couldn't be more simple too. And I'll actually show you what that will look like in the demo shortly. But the reality is you can configure a policy, assign it to the required endpoints that you've already got managed within Sophos Central, and you're pretty much done. We've of course there added some extra nice functionality for users as well, where they can actually manage their own encryption of files using what we call a HTML file encryption wrapper. And the purpose of this really is to secure data in transit via email or whilst being uploaded somewhere or similar. The users themselves have also got the ability to manage their own BitLocker recovery key process by means of what we call our Sophos Central Self-Service Portal. So hopefully you can see there's quite a few things that have been brought in here to make it easier to manage, also have that bit of consolidation with regards to where we keep our security and our encryption. Now, of course, I can't talk about Sophos Central and not really mention this as part of our wider discussion. As many of you are no doubt aware, especially if you've been on a webinar with me before, Sophos Central is what we view as our true single pane of glass, our place for all of our consolidation when it comes to all of our next generation security needs and tools. Now, Sophos Central is truly the beating heart of Sophos Central. So whether you want to manage your Sophos XG firewall, investigate your cloud assets, or even have the Sophos provided managed threat response service conduct threat hunting in your estate, it's all catered to from within Sophos Central. But as mentioned previously, obviously the focus here is the central device encryption piece. And the really great thing about this product is that it utilizes the same agent as our endpoint protection products, so the InterceptX and EDR functionality. So that means that then we can manage and report on device encryption in the same place that we do all of our normal security checks for these endpoints, meaning that it's a lot easier to ensure the estate is not only protected against malware, but then also mean that those same devices are encrypted as they should be, and ultimately that you're falling in line with compliance as and where required. Now, back to, I guess, a bit of a Sophos Central pitch here. So back to the single pane of glass, as we like to call it. The Sophos Central Dashboard is ultimately very rich in information for an at-a-glance view. We've got the ability to deep dive further into each product's logs and reports within a couple of clicks. Likewise, all configuration options are but a couple of clicks away. Sophos Central provides a single pane of glass for visibility across the whole estate, whether that's Windows, Windows Server, Mac, Linux, Android, iOS, Chromebook, virtual servers in our AWS and Azure environments, our email product, firewall, or even our public cloud assets. It's all covered in a single dashboard. And if we were to take, for example, something as simple as user information, should you choose to synchronize your Active Directory with Sophos Central, for example, you can make those users available to the whole Sophos Central platform. So that same user can then be used to align with endpoints that they've got access to, mobiles that they've got access to or that they use, and see visibility of the alerts all in one place. So again, really focusing on that bit of consolidation. The synchronized email address that we can see at the bottom where we see mailboxes, that can be used to protect that user's mailbox via the Sophos Central email gateway. We can use it to test users using our Sophos Phish Threat tool, education tool. Or we can just use that email address that we've synchronized to give access to that previously mentioned self-service portal. Now, of course, when it comes to the encryption point of view, this extends very much to that management as well. It's very easy for us to have an at-a-glance view of all the encrypted devices in our environment, and that means it's very easy to get the right reporting or to actually focus right down onto a single machine to perform tasks such as recovery key retrieval as well. And all of this means that it's actually very then easy for us to have proper encryption coverage throughout our estate, which again, if we come back to the compliance piece, ultimately makes it a lot easier for us to make sure that we can prove we're doing what's required to meet those compliance standards. But now, it's all well and good me sat here telling you how easy it is and I guess throwing up some screenshots. So I think right now is probably a really good place to stop, take a short break from the slides and actually show you what this looks like from within the Sophos Central dashboard. So just bear with me a moment whilst I switch screens. And I'm hoping at this point, everybody can now see my Sophos Central dashboard. So I know that a lot of people here are familiar with Sophos Central, so I won't do much of a whistle-stop tour here. But one of the first things that I'll actually do is go into my people area. So my synchronized users that I mentioned. I'm going to target Mark Lee because he is that Active Directory user that I had from the previous screenshot. Now, if we take a look in here, this looks slightly different from my screenshot, as my screenshots were taken before, but you can now see in my recent events, I've also got information there with regards to BitLocker recovery. So earlier on today, as you can see, I actually used a BitLocker recovery key. And so that has now been revoked from being able to be used. And we have generated a new key, which has now been provided to Sophos Central. Now, I'll get into a little bit more about that information later on, but the point I'm just trying to highlight here is that I've not even gone near the encryption product, and I can already see encryption status for a device that a user is using. Now, in a similar fashion, if I come in and I find this device, so we can see this is Windows 10-SyncSec02, if I click through onto this device, I can still see those events that are associated with this machine, as obviously the BitLocker recovery process is to do with this machine. And again, this view will no doubt be familiar to a lot of you, but notice I've got under my assigned products, I have device encryption. So all of these products, endpoint protection, InterceptX, and the device encryption, they all fall under management and configuration from the core agents. So that means we don't need to have something else running on that machine in order for us to start managing BitLocker. But again, I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail and how we manage deployment shortly. So if I keep scrolling down here, I now also have, again, without even coming anywhere near my encryption part of the dashboard, I can see under my device view, device encryption. I can see the volume ID that is being encrypted here. I can see that last time we saw it on online, it was encrypted, and it was software-based encryption that's leveraging the default that we set here, which is that 256-bit encryption method. We can also see in here the authentication type. So I've set that this machine needs to have startup authentication for a PIN or passphrase, which means that the user will see that traditional blue screen that is booted up, so that they will need to put in a PIN or password here. Of course, the likes of TPM is supported and various other authentication methods, but the main purpose here is that we're saying at this point on the screen, we're able to unlock that and trigger that with a PIN or password. Other couple of bits of useful functionality here, and again, I'll touch on these in a little bit more depth later on, is the fact that I can retrieve recovery key information directly from that machine. I've again not gone into the encryption side here. All I've simply done is found the user, found the device, and then I've been able to come in and see that user's recovery key information. Now, if I were to use this and put this into the machine, as you saw with my alerts earlier on, that key would then be revoked from the system, and we would manage the recovery key process in that we would regenerate a new key to be used, but we would also ask the user to trigger a PIN or password reset so that they don't have the same problem next time that they start up their machine. So the benefits here are quite good in that if the user forgets their password, obviously we can trigger the recovery key just like with any other normal BitLocker management. The better thing about this though is that instead of just then allowing the user to have that recovery key recorded somewhere, maybe print it off, write it down whilst they're on the phone to you, because we're regenerating these, they can't be reused. And again, that user has to set a new PIN or password so that it's not something that they can just keep calling and harassing you, as it were, about. It's a point now where we have restored the machine back to a point where the user can unlock it for themselves. Now, I'll come into a little bit more detail about some of the functionality in a moment. But for those who are existing Sophos Central customers, let's talk about what it might look like to deploy this. So I'm going to come over to my devices on the left-hand side. Again, I'm not going anywhere near my encryption side at the moment. And what I can see in here is the device view that you are all no doubt familiar with already. I can see my host names, my IP addresses, the users that are assigned to them. But then I've got the assigned products tabs or columns that we can see in the middle here. So for us, we've got Endpoint, InterceptX, and I, of course, now have got encryption in here as well. So if I've already got a load of machines and maybe I apply the Sophos Central encryption license and I want to start encrypting those machines, the very first thing that we need to do is to ensure that the software has been assigned to that machine. Now we can do this on an individual basis, as you can see with me hovering over the plus sign here, Or I can click Manage Endpoint Software, and I can do this in bulk. So I can choose a number of machines that I want to push out this part of the Sophos Central agents so that I can end up managing the BitLocker encryption on here for Windows, and if they're Mac devices, manage the file vault encryption process as well. Now, of course, we don't have to have Sophos installed on here to be able to manage encryption. In the same way that if you're looking to install a brand new device, you would come over to Protect Devices, and where we've now got complete Windows installer for endpoint protection, if I click Choose Components, notice that I can actually choose the device encryption module on its own, together with the Intercept X side, or without. So if you're factoring in this into a new device deployment method, or if we're looking to, again, start taking over encryption on existing devices, we've got a number of ways here that we can leverage the installer, the manage assigned software to get the encryption to a point where we can start managing it. But ultimately, within here, this is very simple. You can download the installer, the full installer as it were, from here. And if we don't want then to manage encryption on those devices, well, we can still have it installed without having a policy assigned to them. If we don't have a policy from the encryption side, we're not going to manage the BitLocker just because the software is assigned to that device. So if you're ever unsure about what you've installed and what you've deployed, know that only the policies that have been created are going to be the ones that manage devices. So at this point, I think it's a good idea if we actually click into the encryption area now. And this is where we can start to look at the things that we might want to do on a day-to-day, from either creating policies or looking into our estate to seeing what is encrypted, what could be encrypted, or maybe what even should be encrypted that isn't. So this here that you can see at the moment is the Encryption Dashboard. You can see in the middle, we've got encryption status. I've got 6 machines that could be encrypted. I've got 4 that currently are, out of a total of 10 machines. Now, if I actually click into the total computers here, what this will do is this will highlight the devices just like the main dashboard. But notice now that we're in the encryption dashboard for the computers view at the top. And now we can actually change the view based on the encryption state of the machine. So without encryption installed, devices that could be encrypted, devices that have potentially got encryption suspended. So Windows updates, for example, when they're doing feature updates, might suspend BitLocker, and we'll of course get alerts and notifications generated to the Sophos Central Dashboard. But again, if it's something that you need to be able to report on, it's already there. It's a pre-canned query that you can just ask. And all of these that are in here, of course, once we've got those results, they're all exportable to CSV as well. In a similar fashion, if I come up to the logs and reports, again, I'm currently in the encryption side for this, so the reporting looks a lot thinner than the main dashboard. But if I click on the computers report here, I'm now getting that full device view, everything in my environment, and I'm not only getting to see whether they're encrypted or not, but I'm also getting to see how healthy they were at this point as well. So for example, if I take the Smith's laptop here, Win 10 laptop 01, hasn't checked in for 3 days now. It was in a healthy state when Sophos saw it from a protection point of view, and it was also encrypted when we last saw it as well. So if this device now was deemed to be lost or stolen, then actually we might be able to turn around and say, yeah, that was encrypted, it's healthy. This isn't a device that we need to have a lot of concern with, because everything that we needed to adhere to in terms of compliance and policy have been configured for this device, and it's doing what we expect. In another vein, if I flick back into my main logs and reports here, if I come to the general logs for the whole of the Sophos Central Dashboard, one of the things that we can actually filter down on is actually around the device encryption events. So if I choose all of these, and I'm going to go for the last 90 days, so we get a big chunk of information through here, we can see all the times that I've gone through BitLocker recovery processes, when information has been passed through for IDs, again, when recovery keys have been invoked here. If there's ever been a point where encryption has failed, I've got 0 of those events, unfortunately, in here to show you today. And again, if there's any times where keys are missing, any recovery keys, revoked keys, all of that information is in here. It's not something that we need to hide, but we also understand that it's something that you very much will need to report on to be able to have that assurance in your estate that the encryption is doing what it needs to do. So hopefully that's useful to see for everyone. If I come back into the encryption again, let's take a look at some of the policies. So let's imagine that we've deployed the encryption agent to a machine, and whether it's a fresh machine or existing machine, we've got Sophos on there. We now need to have a policy that is applied to encrypt this device. So I've got some pre-canned ones here for Mac OS and Windows. They do not need to be separated. They can be under one policy. But for the purposes of demonstration, let's create a new device encryption policy. Let's do it so that it follows the device, not the user. And again, all of this should look relatively familiar. We can see the machines that we can allocate, the groups that we can add in. I won't actually add any in for this today, but if we just do a title, and at the moment, the very base policy for this is that it's turned off. As soon as I click device encryption is on, and if I were to save this policy, the machines that this is applied to will now be able to actually start managing encryption end to end. So if this is a new device, we will start to encrypt it based on the rules that you have configured here. So do we want to encrypt the boot volume only? Do we require startup authentication? And maybe do we only want to encrypt the used space to try and increase the speed at which BitLocker encrypts these devices? In a similar fashion to some of our, I guess, security protocols, do we want to trigger a point where the user has to set a new BitLocker password every however many months? So we might actually put this in line with our current password policy so that the user might need to change it every 30 days, 90 days, whatever you see fit. Now, if this is a new device, we will always look to encrypt using the strongest algorithm that we can, which is that XTS one that I showed you on my previous device for 256-bit. But if a device has been encrypted before, the default that BitLocker normally applies when using other encryption methods is 128-bit. Now, that's not something that's a problem for us. Obviously, we can report on those. And if a device is something that we are taking over the encryption from, the point to highlight here is that we don't need to re-encrypt that device. What we will do is we will effectively have a handover from that device where we're actually saying, I'm now taking over the BitLocker management for this asset. We want to regenerate all of the keys and information, and that includes things like the recovery keys. Trigger a new PIN or password if that's what we've got configured within here. Share all that information back to Sophos Central. I say all that information, by the way, we do not ever have the actual keys or passwords that people are using. We only keep the recovery information within Sophos Central. And then from the outset, then we have now taken over BitLocker. It will be reporting within to Sophos Central. And again, we can now start reporting on that and managing it just like a brand new device. So really, really simple. I hope you guys agree. And I hope, again, this is something that's useful to be going through at the moment. The other bit that I mentioned earlier on in my presentation was some of the niceties that we added with regards to the SelfService Portal and the HTML file encryption wrapper. So if I start with the password encryption wrapper, if I come here, you can see I've got password protect files for secure sharing, and we can enable what is called a right-click context menu. E.g., I can right-click on a file, choose to encrypt it, and then what we will do is prompt you for a password. The file will then be encrypted and a new version of that generated so that you can send that securely through whichever method that you deem fit. To make this even easier, we've enabled an Outlook add-in. So if you enable this and we detect that Outlook is installed and the policy is applied here, we will install an add-in that is called Protect Attachments. So when a user is sending an email, they can simply click the Protect Attachments button, and then they will get the same process as though they right-clicked to encrypt that file. So they'll be asked to set a password, and of course, you'll then send that password in another email or another means of communication to whoever it is that needs access to this file. So a nice little feature to add in here. Now, whilst we're on the subject of this, I thought it'd be really useful if I just bring over my virtual machine. And apologies, the screen might refresh a few times now that I've dragged this over. Whilst we were on this call, I actually clicked create a new BitLocker password. So just so that you guys get an idea of what this looks like, I think my screen's just refreshing there. Bear with me 1 second, guys. Left it a bit too long, clearly. Let's log back in. So this is that device that we were talking about earlier for Mark Lee. So I've triggered a password regeneration here where instead of seeing the BitLocker window, I'm now seeing the Sophos one, which is saying I need to set a new password. So I'm going to go ahead and set a new passphrase, click save, and then in the background now, Sophos will now begin that regeneration of recovery keys and IDs and be sharing them back with Sophos Central. But the user now has got through the encryption process, the recovery process, sorry. They're actually into the point where they've put in a new PIN or passphrase. And so all being well, next time they shut down or restart their machine, they should be able just to carry on as normal because they should now know that PIN or password. So that's hopefully another nice thing for you guys to see today. But let's move on to the HTML file encryption wrapper that I mentioned. I've got this super secret file here. It's just a text file. We can encrypt all sorts of formats. Now, what I want to do is encrypt this before I send the file. So I can right click. I can create password protected file, which is our way of saying we're going to encrypt this. I'm just going to set a really simple password, just password1. And you can see now we are changing the name so that it includes HTML. So if you remember, I said we're encapsulating this within a HTML wrapper. So let's do that. Let's click create. I can see my file has now been generated, super secret password file. If we click on this to open it. Apologies for the delay. My VMs sometimes are a bit slow. And what we will see when the page refreshes here is that we'll be prompted now for a password to access this file. So as soon as I've put in my password here, we'll get access to the file, and then we'll see towards the bottom, and please don't hate me for using Edge, this is just my demo. You can now see that I can download that file so that I can now access it in the plain text that it was originally destined. Now, again, if I want to reprotect this file, I also have the option to do this. So I can maybe make changes to this file, drag it back into the browser, and now this can be encrypted going back out. So your recipient of this file can encrypt the file going back to you as well. So a really useful feature, completely separate to BitLocker management, admittedly. But again, I think it's a really nice thing to be able to showcase here for you guys to see what it is that we've got in terms of extra functionality. And again, hopefully that's been useful for you all to see. So we've talked about a number of things so far today. We've looked at how we can deploy the BitLocker management from Sophos Central. We've talked at being able to do individual BitLocker recovery key information, trigger PIN and password resets, and of course be able to report on all of this as well. Just to, I guess, finish this off in terms of the main dashboard view here, one other way that we can search for a recovery key, by the way, is if we choose Get Recovery Key here, we will then be prompted for the first 5 characters of a recovery key. So if, for example, you're maybe not doing Active Directory sync, maybe the users don't know the host name of their machine, we're not limiting you in a way of that you have to search using those methods. You can be on the phone to the user and they can pass you that recovery key identifier so that you can then generate the recovery key process. Now, one last thing that I promised to show you was the SelfService Portal. So I'm just going to bring over another browser here, save me logging out of my existing one. I'm just going to log in, funnily enough, with Mark Lee. He's my poor demo user that I use for everything. And when we sign in here, you can see that the SelfService Portal for Sophos Central is actually made up of a number of components. So if I'm using the Sophos Central email gateway, you can see I can manage multiple my quarantine, my allow block list. I've got something called the emergency inbox, which gives me access to an offline version of my inbox. But what we're here today, of course, is to look at the device encryption. So we can see here's Mark Lee's Windows 10 device that is encrypted, and I can click Retrieve Recovery Key in the exact same way that I can do if I was having access to the Sophos Central admin dashboard. So if you trust your users, I'll let you guys decide whether that's something that you would want for them to be able to access. But again, for me, I think it's just really good to highlight this because we can take some of the management overhead that is traditionally associated with BitLocker and actually be able to have this, pass some of it to the users to reduce the overhead for you. Okay, so let's just get back to my presentation just to finish this off, guys. So we've gone through a number of things today, but I think the key takeaways that I want you to have here are these 3 things that are highlighted. This should be hassle-free for you as an existing Sophos Central customer or a potentially new Sophos Central customer because it's easy to set up and it's easy to manage. From a compliance point of view, hopefully you guys have been able to see that from the simple reports that we can run, from the views that we can demonstrate that compliance very, very easily. And then I guess the last piece on this, again, if you're a Sophos Central customer already, it's a perfect addition to what you've already got in terms of endpoint protection because we're bringing that visibility all into one place for you. You're not having to manage multiple different consoles. As we saw before I even got into the encryption part of the dashboard, I've been able to look at a device, see when it last updated, all of its event and history, including those of the BitLocker encryption. So yeah, hopefully you can see why Sophos could be a good fit to manage BitLocker or even the Mac OS file vault in your environments. We believe, and I will back that up, I believe that this is the easiest way to manage BitLocker centrally. It's a simple yet consolidated way, which is of course what we've always focused on with the Sophos Central Dashboard. And so again, it means that we're only going to take minutes for the admin to configure these policies, deploy full disk encryption, and be able to report that we're compliant when we need to. So guys, I want to thank you very much for your time. I'm just going to switch this over to the Q&A. I haven't got the chat window open, so I'll let Andy and Lee comment if anything has come up at this point. Yeah, if there's anything after this, of course, don't forget to get in touch with IT Health.
Thank you very much, Costa. Excellent, as always. It's Andy Sherritt here again. Thank you, everyone, for your attention during that. So yeah, we'll cover off the questions that we've received. There is still time. If anyone's got anything else they want to ask, please do fire it into the question panel. But I'll start with the ones that came in whilst you were talking, Costa, if that's okay. So the first one from Stefan, what's the benefit of using Sophos Central to store Windows encryption keys compared to using Azure AD via a hybrid joined device?
You know, that's a really good question. So I think that the first point to always highlight here is that, do you firstly have Azure AD in your environment? Is it configured? Is it set up so it's to be hybrid? Or is it a case that you've got a full standalone environment to do so? Now, the things that I've seen, and again, I'm not a Microsoft expert, that's why I work at Sophos and not Microsoft, I guess. But from what I understood is that if you want to be able to manage these keys within the Azure AD side, what we need to do is actually run some PowerShell scripts to be able to offload those keys to Azure AD, as opposed to some of the other methods that we've highlighted today, particularly around the Sophos side, where a lot of this is automated for you. Now, where you keep your recovery keys is obviously very important. So if you are going to have to access a separate console to be able to get this information, that might be seen as a potential management overhead, or for want of a better term, an extra bit of hassle to manage that encryption versus having it within your already protected Sophos estate, for example. Hopefully that answers that question in a roundabout way, Stefan.
Stefan, if you need any more on that, just give us a shout afterwards. There'll be a short survey as soon as we end this. So if you need a bit more info, just put it in there or drop us an email, whatever's easier for you. Next question. Thank you, Bestman. The question is, how can we know that a device has been encrypted at the endpoint? So obviously, that's the sort of thing that we talk about a lot here at IT Health with our assurance dashboard, because we have all sorts of reports like that to show you potentially any machines that might be falling through the cracks. But fundamentally, from a Sophos point of view, Costa, there's also that view within the dashboard, isn't there? So you can see what's been enabled for encryption. Yeah,
so on the dashboard, obviously we covered a few areas that we can see it, and maybe I've misinterpreted the question a bit there, but how do you check? What did I hear that was, how do we check
so basically,
that it's actually on the machine?
How do we get assurance that machines are encrypted, basically?
Okay, yeah. So firstly, if you're sat in front of the machine, you'd be able to click on Sophos and see that data protection is on. Of course, you can do that through the BitLocker management screen as well in the main control panel to be able to see that it's on. But from a Sophos perspective, if you're sat in front of the machine, that is the first and most easy way to do that. If we go back over to Sophos Central, however, if you remember, I said we've got that devices report view. Now, what I'll do is instead of even going near the encryption side here, I'll just come from the dashboard, highlight the devices and user summary that we can see. I'm on the device one that you can see at the moment, click see reports. And then again, already I can see whether device that we're reporting, if it's encrypted, if we're managing it, or whether it's not available altogether, in which case some of my virtual machines are, for example. So it is super easy to get an at-a-glance view to say, are these machines firstly encrypted? If they're not, it's very then easy to go and say, well, why not? Is it because we don't have a policy assigned to them? Is it because we don't have the software assigned to them, as we can see on this devices view here? All that information, as you saw there, was a couple of clicks away from the main dashboard.
Okay, thank you, Bethman. If you need me to give you a bit more on that after the session, just let me know. Quick one from Adita Costa. Does the user need to enter a PIN password each time logging on?
For BitLocker, yes, if you've configured it to do so. You can obviously rely on the TPM chipset. So if in the encryption policy here, I just come back into my pre-canned ones, if I go to my Windows one here, you could actually choose to not require startup authentication. So in that case, we wouldn't ask for that blue screen at the beginning. We wouldn't ask for a PIN or password. Now, of course, if you don't have TPM chipsets, then we would, of course, advise this. The worst thing that you want is somebody to take the hard drive out of the machine and plug it in and see that they can gain access to it. But here, of course, if you don't want it, if you can rely on that TPM chipset, then you can turn off that startup authentication.
Great, thank you. And looks like the last question, certainly for now. Thank you, John. Costa, is it possible to use the dashboard to report on BitLocker encryption status and recovery without actually enforcing the encryption? You with me?
Yeah, I'm with you. So without us having the encryption installed or without us enforcing it as a policy, I guess that's an open question. So if we have got the encryption module installed, so that the software, then yes, we'd be able to report on the status of whether that device is managed or not, and therefore encrypted or not. Obviously, if we've got a policy enabled, then we're going to see if we're encrypting it. I'm going to answer this question in a slightly different way, though. So, for example, if you are an EDR customer, one of the things that you could actually do, let's just say if you don't have the encryption license at this point and you wanted to check out if we've got devices encrypted at this point, you could actually use the EDR functionality via Live Discover to go in and ask one of the pre-canned queries as to whether BitLocker is enabled and pull back the information from that. Now, admittedly, that is not using the BitLocker tool from Central Device Encryption at all. That is just the EDR piece querying the machine, but it shows you've again got choices in here if you're looking to get that information.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, I think that's everything. So thank you everyone for attending and for engaging with some questions. It's always good. Thank you to Lee and Costa for joining us today. As I've mentioned, straight after you leave the webinar, there will be a short survey. If you could really just take a quick moment to fill that in for us, any feedback, but also if there's any additional questions or follow-up questions to what we just answered, that's the best way to do that. Equally, you will have all of our details if you want to get in touch by email or phone. So yeah, thank you and enjoy the rest of the sunny day. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks everyone for your time. Take care.
Thanks all.